All right, welcome everybody. It is now 2 o'clock. I do want to start to open up the panel here. We'll take it slow because there will be some people logging in over time. But I'll introduce myself first so that there's more time for Mercedes and Kevin to give people a chance to get in and meet them. But I am C.W. Briar. I am a local author, at least per RoberCon. I've been going for a few years. I'm the author of Whispers from the Depths, and been writing now for 5-6 years seriously. 2 books, several short stories have been published in anthologies, and loving all of it, so to speak. there's always hurdles and headaches, but I do enjoy it very much. And I'll introduce Kevin first. I'll let him speak.
My name is Kevin Lucia. I'm also a writer. I've been published through Crystal Lake Publishing and Cemetery Dance Publishing. I'm also the review editor for Cemetery Dance Publications. I've been at this about 13 years now. Sold my first short story 13 years ago. And like Chuck said, I wouldn't rather be doing anything else, So yeah, a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of editing. That's what I do.
All right. And we're saving the best for last. We have Mercedes Yardley. And we want to introduce her. If you've been going to Realmakers for a while, she has not visited us because she's quite a distance away, but I'll let Mercedes introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Mercedes M. Yardley. I live in Las Vegas. I'm coming to you from my mother's basement because we're visiting. This is my brother's old room. And I'm a writer. I do horror. I won the Bram Stoker Award for a story called Little Dead Red. Lots of writing, lots of making weird crafts. I do horror quilts. I do stuff like that. So I love it. It's what I do.
Yeah, there's one more panelist, Chuck, there. Did you see that message?
Yeah, I'm seeing a message here. We were hoping to have either Joe Sullivan or John Burrell from Cemetery Gates Press or Media. So we'll see if they can get in there. He's contacting me now, see if he can hop on. But
yeah, he's in here as an attendee.
Oh, is that okay? Is that who that is?
That's John Burrell. He's here as an attendee, so he somehow needs to get up here. I don't know if he followed.
Okay. I see him right now. All right. He's hopping in now, so we'll give him a couple seconds. But I'll introduce. I will show here if we can switch the camera over to me.
All right.
There's John. Okay, yeah, well, I'll let John go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Hi. My name is John Burrell. As Chuck said, part of Cemetery Gates Media. We're a small indie publisher from Binghamton, New York. With my co-writer Joe Sullivan, we've written several short story collections, anthologies, and we're also publishing other authors' works as well, mostly kind of in the urban legend, kind of campfire story, like realm of horror.
Okay.
That's me.
Great to have you, John. So
thanks.
Now, before I go to the first questions, I came prepared. I have some pictures here, so we'll see if we can get the video feed switched over to me here. And I'm not controlling it. We do have some help, and I appreciate the help, but let's see here. And I will mention before we get started as well, for anybody who logs in, you're welcome to post questions in the Q&A. I'm going to have a few questions to start, go for about half hour or so. But there will be some time saved if anyone else has any follow-on questions. And hopefully there's minimal tech issues. I know that there's always things that kind of pop up as these kind of things happen. It's a bummer that we can't come to you in person, but we're happy to have some kind of connection. And hopefully next year, RoberCon will be back on to an in-person event. But see, I do have some pictures. I don't know if people can see it, but I have here from Kevin some books of his. Look him up. Kevin writes some great small town horror. They have some beautiful covers too.
Yeah,
so there's those.
Baldwin.
Yes. Yep. Ben Baldwin. And then Mercedes, I have her book here. She's multiple books, but Little Dead Red. This one has the special edition. This has a beautiful cover as well. And one special thing here, I have one of the anthologies from Cemetery Gates from John and Joe. And actually, all 3 of us are included in that. Kevin, Mercedes, and I all have stories in this. Great collection. Thankfully, there's people like Kevin and Mercedes to put in some good content. But actually, there's a brand new book coming out, a new anthology from Cemetery Gates as well. And so congrats on that. So first question. Yep. I want to kind of dive back into our panelists here and see what makes them tick. Horror is an interesting genre. I think a lot of people have preconceived notions when they hear horror author. They sometimes are concerned, sometimes question where those stories come from. And that's one thing I want to talk about as these questions go on, some of the misconceptions about the horror community. But I'll ask each of our panelists. I'll start with Mercedes. What drew you to the horror genre, to writing in general, and was there anybody instrumental in you pursuing that?
Yeah, I mean, I always wrote as a kid. Horror was very frowned upon. I grew up in small town Utah, very religious community, so you weren't supposed to talk about anything that was dark or scary. But I always wrote about it. I also, it's a really tragic community that I'm from. We had this big fire. Everybody's either a miner or works for the power plant where I'm from. And when I was a kid, about 5 or 6, we had this big fire that killed 27 people. And in such a small community, that affected everybody. So I had a whole bunch of friends that suddenly lost their dads, and it was really devastating, but nobody ever really talked about it because you're supposed to be positive and pray your way through and things. And so I found that I would write about things that I wasn't allowed to talk about because it was a way for me to process. And I actually didn't write horror until I 10 years ago is when I started identifying with the horror genre, because I'd always been told it was very, horror I thought was, splatter punk and, the Saw movies, and I didn't see the nuance and the redemptive value in it. So when I kind of got over what I thought the stigma of horror was and realized what it really is, it's about dread and emotion and community and processing. That's when I started to identify with the label. But I always wrote it, and I had a 4-H teacher, actually, because, we all did 4-H down here. When I was about 8 years old, that was like, these stories you write are really good. And I think you should pursue that. And I didn't really know that you could pursue things like that. I thought you had to get like a real job, you had to do all these things, and writing was something you did for fun. But she was very instrumental. And later on, I had her as a teacher in middle school. She was instrumental in telling me that I had talent, and she would help me find places to submit my work because I didn't know how to find contests and things like that. And this was, before the internet, so you didn't just hop on and find things. So she would go on her teaching materials and find contests that I wouldn't have had access to. And she really encouraged me, and I love that. And she lives here, so it's good to be back home. I'm at my parents and see all these people that kind of, I don't think she's proud I do horror, but she's proud that I'm writing. So at least I haven't thrown that aspect away, in her opinion.
Great. Kevin, would you like to talk about your background?
Yeah, a lot of it is very similar to what Mercedes just sketched out for you. I mean, I grew up in a moderately strict Baptist household, so anything like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, that was all verboten, that was pretty much forbidden. I don't think we even watched an R-rated movie in our house until after I graduated high school. So, but the funny thing about that is, and I always classified myself as a sci-fi fan when I was a kid, but when you look back, I always liked the weirdness. I was continually reading, the scary tales that tell in the dark, and I read a lot of ghost stories. I didn't really process that as horror, because like Mercedes said, my thought from horror, from my parents' filter, was slasher films and things like that. And as a kid, that didn't interest me. But I always read stories about ghosts and weird parallel dimensions. And when I was in elementary school, I checked out all the I got one here, but it's too far for me to grab. The Universal Monsters had the picture books. There's one for the Mummy and Frankenstein and Wolfman. I was always reading those. For some reason, as a kid, that didn't translate into horror, because by my parents' definition, horror was this over here. And for a long time in college, I was a Stephen King fan, but I didn't really think of myself as a horror fan. I wanted to write science fiction. And what really drew me toward horror, I think, is that I went through a period of my life in college where I was very directionless. I was kind of depressed. I just wasn't happy with my life. And for whatever reason, science fiction was not addressing those needs I had inside. And when I felt myself really, really digging into Stephen King even more and things like that, I felt like I wanted to write horror, and that's what drew it to me. Was it just that, and I realized through several rejections, my science fiction was really very bad Star Trek fan fiction. And it wasn't, you get to that realization, you're like, this is not going to sell at all. And then also just realizing that science fiction just wasn't doing it anymore.
Okay. And John, make sure you have to make sure you're on mute. But yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in like 3rd grade. And that was kind of like the impetus, I guess, for getting into all that. I mean, I grew up on Scooby-Doo cartoons and I was always into like spooky stuff. But yeah, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was like really like the big jumping off point for me in terms of getting into horror. And yeah, I mean, it was just like something I didn't have any, like my parents weren't like anti-horror. I didn't like grow up in like some, restricted household or something. I just, just was something I was just drawn to. I just like aesthetically and, it was like fantasy. I've always liked fantasy, and that's just, I feel like it's just like, for me, it's an offshoot of just fantasy. Anything, it takes real life problems and kind of puts like a supernatural or fantastical bent on it. So yeah, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Are You Afraid of the Dark? Got way into that stuff. And, but yeah, so then, I was always a writer. I wrote a lot. I did comic books and stuff when I was a kid. And then, I didn't really get into horror writing until about, I guess it was 2000, like 5 years ago, five or so years ago. My buddy, the longtime co-writer Joe Sullivan and I just decided to, hey, we've always been into Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and we have loved, like, we used to go on trips together and like find weird locations and like stuff that was like urban legend and stuff, and just take photos and do blogs of them and stuff. And they're like, hey, why don't we turn that into a book? So like we did that one book, and then it kind of grew into a whole bunch of other books. Now it's just like a thing, it's just a whole slew of books now. So yeah, that's my journey.
Thank you. I know when it comes to horror, and you can hear different stories, different backgrounds. I have a lot of similarities with our panelists. Kind of a quiet, I wouldn't say repressed background, but more lighthearted background. People are surprised that I ended up pursuing horror, but then again, I'm always that person who, even as a kid, I had the dinosaurs. Everything that had teeth and could eat things was cool. So it goes even back to then. I noticed. But my next question is related to that. Where do your stories come from? I know for me, those concepts are there. I've always liked fantasy. I always like spooky things. And those ideas kind of merge together with questions and topics I want to explore. Like with my novel, I wanted to pursue that question of, the idea of all you need is love, and love can fix everything. But I also realize that puts people in a very vulnerable place. And there's a lot of horrific things that can happen from that. So I took an idea I had with water spirits and merged it with that idea of love actually being quite vulnerable and sometimes horrific in that way, where you can get hurt. But the panelists, I want to ask, John, why don't you go first? Where do your stories come from?
Did you say John?
Yes. Yep. Go ahead.
Sorry, it's cutting out a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's like one of those things. I just think it's just from everyday life sort of things. I take inspiration from everything. A news headline that's like wicked weird, like, what, they found this like alligator roaming the streets in this random town. Let's write a story about that. Or like sometimes it'll be like a story like, one time when I was a kid, we went to the beach and I thought I saw a doppelganger of my mom. And so we ended up writing a story about that. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's like in terms of like thematic stuff or like real life issues. I mean, my stuff tends to be more like, campfire stories like that isn't as like deep or mature. But I mean, when I do want to get into that stuff, it is usually from a place of, from my own fears and, or Joe's own fears or stuff like that. So, from everywhere. Yeah.
Kevin, how about you?
It's changed, like every young writer, the first thing you do is you try to copy the people that you love. So I spent several years just writing bad Stephen King and Lovecraft rewrites, and trying to get my feel for it. And a lot of my early stories were very, I'm writing horror stories, so a lot of the stories in my first collection, things slipped through. They're decent stories, but they weren't really, I wasn't writing interior. I was writing I'm going to write a woman in white story. We're going to write a Wendigo story. That I was very much trying to kind of hit all the tropes. Through that period, I attended Borderlands Press Writers Boot Camp, and began an email exchange with the legendary Mort Castle. And Mort emailed, he sent me this email with this advice where he said, if I can remember the paraphrase, he said the best stories are the ones about the late night questions we ask ourselves. And that was a really big turnkey for me when I really started writing on the interior. And then every story that I write, for the most part, not always, but every story I write has got to start with an emotional core. Well, I always, for a long time, I was like, oh, I got to figure out the plot. And that didn't work for me. But then when I started figuring out, well, what is this guy's fear? What is he afraid of? What is his chief weakness? How could it possibly be his downfall? Or how is he struggling to overcome this fear? And very likely not, and a lot of it's me. A lot of it is, like John said, I will see things that I think are interesting or weird or disturbing, and that'll end up, and some of them are personal fears. I had a situation where one summer we went to Enchanted Forest up in a water safari up in the Adirondacks, and in a very scary situation, one of the water tubes with my son, which was really frightening, and everything turned out okay, but that ended up becoming a story. So that happens a lot, where things I'm personally afraid of, when I look in the mirror, it ends up on paper.
And Mercedes?
Very similar to that. I find that I am writing to process the things that I'm worried about. So a lot of my stories tend to be very having to do with society. I think the one that's in the book that we're all in together of John's, I think that's the one where it's a woman that gets raped at a club and it goes on someone puts it on YouTube. And so I wrote about that, and I did a play with that, and like the Swan Princess story fairy tale where you take someone's coat and they're stuck there, so he took her clothes and she was stuck in this situation. And I wrote a story about my hometown. Pretty Little Dead Girls is probably my favorite novel I ever wrote. Takes place in the area where I'm from, where there's just tragedy, and that kind of came from a person that came up to me in a bank one day in Seattle, and he looks at me and he says, "You're the type of girl that gets murdered." And I was like, I know. And we had this weird conversation, and that's the opening line of that story is Bryony Adams was the type of girl who got murdered. So, things that people will say or things that I'm worried about, or, I'm just working it out on paper. I'm just talking about it in a way where I can explore it in a safe environment. And like I said, I think it comes from not being able to talk about these things out loud, but I could always write about them. So my journals, I have like 15 journals, from all the way up until I think I first got married, where I was just trying to figure things out because we weren't allowed to express it. And so I think they're all the things that I'm worried about. And, it's all very character driven. What is this character terrified of? That's what we're gonna, and it's very unflinching and brutal to look at what terrifies you. But I think that's why so many horror writers are very well adjusted. We just are, because we, face those fears and we work through them. We don't have to hide them like I feel like sometimes other genres have to.
Yep. And actually, there's been some research I saw posted recently on dealing with 2020, is that people who enjoy horror are generally processing it better because there's that mental state that they've been going through of what's the worst that can happen and how can I get through it. So.
Right. And we're just kind of the pandemic, we hate it, but we're like, yeah, I've gone through this in my head a zillion times already. Yeah.
So I'll give a quick question here because we want to get through some more. But if you could possess one horror writer, living or dead, and take over their writing style and become them, who would you choose? Mercedes?
I'd have to go with the famous Edgar Allan Poe, just because I think we have a similar melancholy countenance, but his word choice is just gorgeous. The words and phrases he uses, I would love to be able to just have that in my vernacular and just be able to pull those out at will. Just beautiful.
All right, great. Kevin?
Probably everyone's assuming that I'm going to go for the big daddy, Stephen King. But ironically enough, I was thinking about this the other day. It would have to be Robert McCammon. Robert McCammon, even in his horror novels, there's just a spark of magic there that I just find wonderful. And then some of his like really weird novels, like Gone South and things like that. And it's just, you know, and he's able to write like one of his novels, The Wolf's Hour. It's a World War II novel about a secret agent. I mean, yeah, the secret agent happens to be a werewolf, but it's really a World War II novel about behind German enemy lines. And it's just, he's just amazing at what he does stuff like that. So it definitely would be Robert Cannon.
Right. And John?
Geez, this is a really hard question. I want to say Ray, but just for his language, but probably Richard Matheson was like, I mean, he's just one of my all-time favorite writers, and he was just like the king of like the twist story. And if you've read any of our stories, like we just really love twists. And so, and just like writing really economical short stories that touch on big themes, but they are also just like taught, you know, these taught stories that you just walked away from kind of like bewildered. Like that's why they made such great Twilight Zone episodes and stuff. So yeah, probably Richard Matheson.
Now, what you can't see is just off camera, I have my Mercedes Yardley shrine because I'm working on taking over Mercedes so I can write like her.
Right. You can wear a pretty flower in your hair.
Yeah, so look at that. No, I really love and appreciate authors who have language that dances. Mercedes is definitely one of those. Josh Malerman, Ray Bradbury. There's just moments where I see a line, I'm just, that was so gorgeous, I wish I could write that. So, but I really appreciate that when I'm reading a horror author. But next, before I go to the next question, I want to let audience members know if you want to post questions in the Q&A, there is one now. We will save some time for Q&A questions. But next question, what has surprised you as you've gone from maybe a hobby writer into a professional, as you've gone into the horror community? Now all of us are authors, and John is also a publisher as well. What has surprised you, for good and for bad, going into serious writing and joining with the horror community? Kevin, why don't you go first?
I think I'll skip over because every writer starts out thinking I'm going to be famous and sitting in a cabin by a lake and sipping a glass of wine and writing when I feel like it. Every writer goes through that. So we'll skip past that. I think the thing that surprised me the most as I try to transition, again, I don't write full-time, I do teach full-time, but the jobs get more and more, have been gotten more and more frequent the last couple of years. I don't think I was prepared for the fact that, especially with the horror genre, you're really joining one big, huge, incredibly supportive, but often dysfunctional family. You know, so and then there's pros and cons of this, right? But we'll go with the pros first. I mean, just you start going to conventions and you're making the rounds, you're meeting people and you're meeting editors and stuff, and you initially, I know for me, honestly, initially you filtered all this through making contacts. I want to sell my writing, you know, I'm trying to make my bones here. Then suddenly you look back and realize that you've got this whole family that you only ever see them at conventions. And that starts becoming more like you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go to this convention. I might sell a book or two. I really don't care because Bob Ford's going to be there, or Kelly Owen's going to be there, or, you know, oh, I'm going to get to meet Mercedes for the first time. You know, so you stop worrying about how many books you're going to sell, and, you know, is everyone going to love me? And you're like, these people have become like my tribe. You know, they're like, these are, you know, and when you start like just calling these people up and going and hanging out with them when there are no conventions, then you know that this is something special that came out of your desire to pursue art. The flip side is I do remember one day, I don't know what it was one of the first internet scuffles I probably viewed from afar, and I just kind of shook my head and I thought to myself, this is like the high school cafeteria all over again. You know, it's like, am I going to go sit with these people? If I go sit with those people, I'm going to get in trouble from those people by sitting with these people. If I take sides on this issue, then this people's going to, and that, of course, is the risk of being in community. Like, I've seen a lot of people who will get mad at the flare-ups and saying, well, that's why I don't like community. And I'm like, but that's part of it. If you're going to enjoy the benefit of being part of this family, every now and then Thanksgiving dinner is going to go crazy. I mean, that's how it is, you know, and I wasn't prepared for that. You know, I didn't think that these people I met at conventions would be non-blood family to me, and they are, you know, and it's like I said, at the end of the day, you're more, I'm looking forward to hanging out with this person. I don't care if I sell a single book this week.
And Mercedes?
I have to agree. I didn't realize that I was going to care about the people that I work with as much as I do. One of the things that really surprised me about turning it from hobby to profession is how much work it is that's not involved with the writing. I thought that writers wrote and everybody else did the marketing and all of that stuff. And I guess it used to be that way, and that's what I had always heard. But I spend probably the least amount of time writing. I spend most of my time doing other things, and you know, just kind of learning how the business works, learning how to, you know, do these different things, researching publishers, researching all these things, and then there's all the fallout. Another thing that surprised me, and Kevin knows this, my first publishing company that I was with just tanked and took everyone down with them in the most horrific way. And owed me a couple grand and all these things, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know that happened. I didn't know that happened. And Kevin was like, hey, there's this other company, Crystal Lake, which we both work with now, and he's like, he'll take your old books. I mean, things like if your company goes down and you have books with them, what do you do with your books after that? You know, what do you do when all these things happen? And I just was surprised at you know, how many things fold, how many, you know, how hard it is to keep publishing companies running, how many things kind of can go bad. And I was surprised at how much I had to learn about business, because I thought I was going to be, as a writer, I was just going to sit and write. But it's been really good because I like learning all these things and knowing all these things. But for me, the best part definitely was how close I've gotten to all these people that have a similar mindset that I do. So I can like say to my husband, hey, you know, and talk about the book, and he gets it, but our life is in a different place. I can talk to my, you know, I can talk shop all I want with these people that are just as geeky about it as I am. I love that. That's one of the best surprises.
And John, one thing interesting for you and Joe is you guys are more heavily involved in the indie side versus more like the small press side with Kevin and Mercedes, but also your publishers. And so you guys have some unique perspective there. What has surprised you, for good and for bad, merging into the horror community that way?
I mean, I do want to say, I just wanted to answer kind of like just in general, just like kind of echo like Mercedes and Kevin's statements. Like, yeah, the community is like really awesome and approachable, and like it's like a tribe, and it is very like, I mean, the majority of people I've met over the years have just been really cool. Like I said, super approachable, like great writers, but also just like cool people as well. And like, there's been like a couple like things, like not even like in writers, just like things that have happened in the writing community that were just like, oh, this guy never delivered $50,000 of this Kickstarter you're supposed to do, or something like that. But it's like those things are every, you know, very few and far in between. So like, yeah, it's been just like a really positive experience so far. But yeah, I mean, the publishing thing, it's been, yeah, it's like a different, it's definitely a different animal. I think like, I mean, you know, it is like it's helped to like definitely build up, like just know, like, because it is a community, like you can like so easily connect with writers and stuff, like, you know, so many writers we just connect with on Twitter and stuff like that, you know. And it's just like, I don't know how things worked in the 80s or whatever, like how, you know, I guess people just were constantly mailing in stuff, and, you know, now it's just as easy as an email and getting checking out somebody's manuscript and going, hey, this is cool, and getting the deals going. And yeah, so it's something, you know, it's more work. Obviously, it's a whole other thing. But we were already doing, like, even just when we were doing our own books, like, I mean, almost anybody who is like an indie writer and is doing their own stuff, putting their own stuff out, is like sort of like a publisher in their own realm, like having to do all the marketing themselves, like handle all the art, all that stuff, and go to, you know, so it was kind of just like a transition to like, okay, now we're also going to take on, you know, take all these skills we learned over the years and like, you know, like help people out who, you know, who don't have those who maybe don't have that experience yet, or they want to be part of this brand and whatnot. So it's a cool thing.
And I'll just echo, I've been surprised at how warm the horror community is as I've merged in. I went to StokerCon last year, and I mentioned I was there for the StokerCon for the Horror Writers Association. And the people giving me the coffee give you a weird look, like, oh, scary people. But and they asked how it was. I said, it's very pleasant. And that was the honest truth. But I think one thing that's interesting with the writing horror community is that we geek out over the monsters more than like with sci-fi. You've got the technology and the fantasy, the magic. We geek out over monsters and over slasher movies and things like that. But so many horror writers are writing from a place of vulnerability. So I've also noticed, as I've gotten to know a lot of horror writers, they're quite sensitive, and they tend to be very warm-hearted because they are writing from that place of, that concern for themselves and for others. So that's been a surprise, going from an outsider to somebody who's gotten to know a lot of writers. Next question. Actually, I'll go back to the list I had here. Sorry. How do you think the horror community or the horror genre is changing? Publishing itself is a big process, both technical, culturally. There's a lot of shifts happening in writing in general, but also the horror community. Where do you see the horror genre and the horror community changing in the next 5 to 10 years? Mercedes.
I think it's a great horror renaissance going on right now. That's my main thing. I think it's becoming much more mainstream and less stigmatized. So I think we're seeing more and more horror, and people are beginning to talk about it a little more openly. And we have, like, especially with movies right now, there's so many great horror movies that just came out, like the Quiet Place and, all these different ones that just came out that I blanked on all of them, Us and all these different things. But we're talking about, we're taking all these things that are going on in the world and processing them in a way where we can all sit down and talk about them afterward, which I love, right? And I think that we're going to find it a little more acceptable. I think we're going a little grimmer right now with our literature, but not necessarily our movies so much. And I think that I think we're just going to see it a lot more of it. And I love that it's being less stigmatized, because I hate that I'm so in love with this genre that people just kind of look at and are like, oh, well, that has no worth, when that's not true. The people that say it has no worth are the ones that either aren't reading horror at all, or are reading horror that they just don't identify with. And they need to look at some of the other things that are around, because I find it so life affirming, so healthy, so binding, and it helps us, come together to talk about these things that we were scared of, and such a positive, healthy place. I just think we're going to see a lot more of it, and it's going to be grand. It's going to be grand.
Okay. John?
That's a good answer. I'm glad it's going to be grand. So yeah, I would say, I think this is something that's been really good in the last several years anyway, but it can only get better, is just more diversity and voices in the horror community. And that just that's something that obviously needs to happen across the board in every genre. But I think it has been something that I've noticed in recent years. There has been more diversity in voices, and which is really awesome. Get more different perspectives, and everybody gets their shot at being out there. So I really like that. And then just in terms of who knows what's going to go. I'm imagining there's going to be more pandemic stories coming up, or I don't know what's going to happen to all this COVID stuff. But I'm assuming it's going to, the nature of stories and how society is now. And that's definitely going to affect the stories that are being written and whatnot. So those are kind of the biggies, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think COVID's going to have an interesting impact. I don't know how much impact it'll have on pandemic stories, but I think it's going to change how authors approach the social aspect of a situation that we're now going through. But and Kevin, you as well. How do you think things will change in the next 5-10 years?
Well, I do have to echo the sentiments about the diversity of voices, both from different cultures, and I know I can say for me, I never considered myself somebody who only read, from one culture, one person, but you just don't. There are so many great writers out there right now from different cultures and backgrounds. I just never would have considered if we hadn't even seen the diversity we see now. Like, I don't want to butcher his name, but Usman T. Malik, he's got a collection coming out, and I just can't wait for that. Like, I just can't wait for that. It's Pakistani horror, and I think that's great, you know, and like stuff like The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval and Lovecraft Country. I think this is really, really, really important, you know, that this is going to make horror not just, I remember reading an essay once in prepping for my horror unit at school. I don't even remember the source was, so honestly, I can't remember how credible the source was, but it called the horror genre was an American luxury. That because we have such a high standard of living, we can write certain types of horror stories. And it was kind of pointing out the fact that there are other horror stories around the globe that don't get the same type of voice. And I think it's great that we're getting that kind of voice. You know, as far as also indie publishing, small press publishing, I think you're seeing a threshold here where, you know, again, back in the 80s, you either got published with a big publisher. I can't even remember when Cemetery Dance started. I think they started in like the late 80s. You didn't really have a lot of options. And I think that, you know, we went through the whole thing with ebooks, and there's a glut of bad ebooks, and the whole thing through self-publishing. And we've got through that, I think, to where, you know, like what John and Joe are doing with Cemetery Gates is great. That they're opening these doors, and you get to see two people who love horror, who have the resources, and have smart business sense. It just opens the doors for everyone else, you know. And my last thing is, believe it or not, is I think we've got so many streaming platforms that are putting out some great horror movies. And not only that, I think of the success of things like Stranger Things, The Haunting of Hill House, and I'm just like chewing at the bit to get to The Haunting of Bly Manor. These are things that I see lots of non-horror people avidly enjoying, you know, and I think when we get like a lot of people, unfortunately didn't do so well at the box office, but a lot of people who are not horror fans love Dr. Sleep, you know, and I think if we can get that good quality, I mean, I love a brainless slasher flick as much as the next person, but I think the more we can get good quality movies out there, like Mercedes, I don't like horror. Oh, I really like, my wife loves Stranger Things and she hates horror, you know, so the more we get stuff like that out, the better it's just going to be for the genre overall.
Yep. And I'll add one thing, and this applies to fiction in general, not just horror. A big shift is going to be towards audiobook. They're seeing that now. Publishers recognize it. There was a big question for a long time of, is ebooks going to take over traditional print, hard copies? That's plateaued. That's leveled out. The area that we see growth now is in audiobooks. So I think that's going to be a big surge for horror genre books, but books in general. But those are all great answers. I do want to get into our Q&A question. I'm going to combine it with a question of mine as well, and then I'll open it to the floor. You can hop in at any time. But the question came in from Jamie Conan. Is it harder to write when your antagonist is a supernatural thing rather than a person? And I want to add into that question I had, what are some mistakes that new authors make when writing horror? Because I think there is a related topic here. I'll speak first here. I think with supernatural things, one thing a lot of maybe beginning writers miss is that the scares don't necessarily come from the entity itself. You want to lean into the emotions and the thoughts of the character. We want to feel and share their dread. Yes, you need that entity, that supernatural thing to inspire the fear, but you want to lean in from a storytelling perspective towards the character. And that's actually, especially for literature, books lean into the emotions more than other mediums. But so those are the questions there. What is it harder to write your antagonist when your antagonist is a supernatural thing compared to a person? And also, what are some mistakes new writers make in writing horror?
I'll start.
Any one of us?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kevin.
So again, a lot of my early stories had your really classic tropey protagonists, like Wendigos, zombies, demons, things like that. I really hit a real turning point when I discovered the quiet horror of T.M. Wright and Charles Grant. And there are supernatural entities in those books, but there was such a level of, I don't know how else to say this, mundanity, if that's the right word. All the strength that he puts on those stories are the people, and it's the people whose mistakes and flaws that these forces take advantage of. So it wasn't even the monsters that was that scary. It was what these people had done to themselves, and that was a big turning point for me.
I think that writing a supernatural character isn't different from writing from people. I think they still have their wants, they have their desires, they have their end goal. It might just be different than we as a human race would want. But, you know, honestly, I think so many people, especially people that are attracted to horror, kind of feel that sense of otherness anyway. You know, I didn't fit into my community. I don't fit in here. You know, I'm a Mormon in the horror writing community, and then I'm a horror writer, you know, from a small Mormon community. So where do I fit? I am that supernatural being. I am not part of this community. You know, I don't feel interlocked in that way. I always felt a little bit off, a little bit outside, a little bit. And I think a lot of people that write horror do in some way or another, especially because of that stigma we talked about. So I don't think it's really any different. What does that being want? What is their goal? I mean, they're going to have them. It could just be to feast on blood, but they want something so badly that they're willing to put themselves through, you know, a whole novel or story length or screenplay length, you know, trial to get it. So I don't really think it's that different. And I think some of the mistakes that early writers make, and I think Kevin hit it on the head, sometimes writing to trope, sometimes writing what you hear or what you think that the story should be instead of what you think the story should be. Like what is the true story? Well, okay, you have a vampire, right? Great. Well, he wants blood. Well, all the vampires in the movies look like this, act like this. My favorite character that I ever wrote is actually my first novel that I haven't published because I just kind of went on and I need to go back to it. It's a vampire and his name is Ray. And he's just this like teenage boy that got bit as a kid, and he's a vampire, and it sucks, dude. And he works in a bakery, and that's not cool. And he has like, you know, anger issues because he's a teenage boy, you know, that has bloodlust that he tries to keep in check. And he's very different. And like his temperature always ran hot. And one of my friends read the original book, and she was like, no, vampires are always cold. And I'm like, Ray's not, you know, like to take the tropes that you like and hear, you know, and make your own, like break free from what someone's telling you something has to be. I think that's a mistake that people don't do. You don't have the confidence to like stand against what you're told something should always be. If it's a horror story, there should be blood. Someone should be licking the inside of someone's skull. Not necessarily, you know, you do what you want to do. I think relying on what you're told too much is one of the main mistakes writers make. Okay. New writers.
Yes. And John, I'll give you 90 seconds because we're running up to the end. No, you're fine.
I didn't have too much to say about the first question. I mean, yeah, I echo what Mercedes said. I mean, it doesn't need to be, they can have the same level of motivation, of fear, of want as much of a non-spiritual entity. So for me, it's like, there's no difference. So just write the way whoever you want it, write it. Then for the second question, I would say, yeah, avoid tropes, cliches, write something and then erase it and then write something different, you know, write the first thing that comes in your head, but then like, usually that's not a good idea. So go back and, kind of, you know, try and offer something new. Like think more like, look outside yourself really almost like, and think like from an editorial perspective, like after you write something, oh, have I read something like this before? Is this a cliche? And then just try and, you know, adapt it. I mean, if it's something that really suits your fancy, you know, I mean, don't toss it out completely, but, you know, just try and work it a little bit. So.
All right. And I'll chime in here before we close. One last thing, an idea came to mind. One thing that comes up with supernatural entities or monsters in general, there is one difficulty, and that's in a longer story. If the fear that they're causing is based on their power, as readers get used to that and adapt to it and learn how to deal with it, it loses its fear. It's a monster that's scary initially. There's a reason you hold off on showing it in a movie because the fear only lasts so long. With a human character, you have evolving emotions, and so you can change the rules, so to speak, more easily. But with a supernatural entity, if it's not something that has an emotional investment like Dracula, it can be hard to keep that fear going. But we'll close there. It's 2:45, and there's other panels going on. But I want to thank our panelists, Mercedes, Kevin, and John. Thank you for hopping on. If even if you didn't like the panel, go buy their books. Just go buy their books. Look up Mercedes, Yardley, Kevin, Lucia, John Burrell with Cemetery Gates Media. They've got some great stories. They're all great writers. Look them up. We're all on social media. You can find us there. And thank you for attending the panel. All right,
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.